I wanted to do a video to talk about something that I saw earlier. And what I saw earlier is buzz about this carbon capture pipeline that they want to do. After further reading more up on this, to be quite honest, I'm disgusted. It's definitely not a good idea. It's extremely dangerous, and looking up some of the maps that they have on this, if you're interested in seeing if it's in your state, just Google or whatever search engine you use, carbon capture, and then your state's name. It's going to be happening in mine. And I seen that it was in the infrastructure bill, and there was $12 billion going towards this, but I didn't think that this was going to get started immediately, or that they even had ongoing projects with this. Actually, if you guys remember a news story, I don't know if I have any subscribers from Mississippi. I can't remember the name of the town. Give me 1 second. Satardia. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. But last year in February, a CO2 pipeline exploded, engulfing Satardia, Mississippi, in a noxious green fog that left residents, which it's not always colored, that left residents confused, convulsing, foaming at the mouth, and even unconscious. An episode that augurs danger for what could be a coming wave of new CO2 pipelines across the country. A 19-month investigation by Huffington Post and the Climate Investigator Center reveals. I remember seeing that on the news. They didn't say what kind of gas caused that. And apparently, when you condense CO2 down into like a liquefied form and run it through pipes at high pressure like that, it's at very high risk for rupture or exploding, or for something to go wrong. And because it's so condensed, if that were to happen in the middle of a community like they plan on running it through, it could kill a whole bunch of people instantly. So it's very disturbing. I'm going to look more into this, because I am not okay with any of that shit around my house, first off. Second off, while making this video, you guys need to look this up in your state. And if you have any within a few miles of your home that's going to be built, because God knows there's not going to be people out in the streets protesting this. Look where we are right now. So my next suggestion is going to be, if you do not have a gas mask, get one. I'm actually going to be ordering one for my whole family and myself. So let me play a little clip for you. This was a briefing on the people that are actually trying to fight this and stand up to this. Unfortunately, it didn't work because it got passed in the infrastructure bill. Like I said, $12 billion is going towards this. And, you know, with everything coming that's going to be monitoring carbon footprints of everyone and everything, this is going to be really hard to fight. So Let me play you this clip.
And I'm really excited to be sharing this with all of you tonight. And because you are the pipeline fighters, I want to start this presentation with a quick video clip that shows you what you're really up against. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about CO2 pipelines running through your communities. And so if you remember nothing else from what I say in the next 10 minutes, I'd love for you to remember this video.
This video shows a rupture of a buried, dense phase carbon dioxide pipeline. The experiment was conducted in the safe environment of the DNVGL Spade Adam Testing and Research Centre to assess the consequences of such ruptures in terms of mass outflow, crater formation and dense gas dispersion. The viewer should note that the extent of the visible plume does not necessarily represent the extent of the dense gas hazard.
That was a controlled test in an isolated area. It's important to remember because the next CO2 rupture that you see is unlikely to be controlled, and it's unlikely to be in an isolated area. Overwhelmingly on a handful of places. Nebraska is one of them. The others tend to focus on sending the CO2 to West Texas and Southern Louisiana. And that means we're seeing an intense concentration of CCS activity and proposals concentrated on a relatively small number of areas. We're seeing, Carolyn is going to talk about the situation in the Midwest. I want to talk very briefly about the situation in the South because we're seeing massive proposals for CCS development and CO2 pipelines in Louisiana's Cancer Corridor and from ExxonMobil in the Gulf Coast of Texas. But those pipelines carry some really significant risks. Although people assume that CO2 is safe, when you condense it to the pressures that it has to be under to be shipped in pipelines, it becomes a fundamentally different substance. It is highly corrosive. And if it becomes contaminated with moisture, or with hydrogen sulfide, it becomes even more corrosive, and that creates the risks of catastrophic pipeline fractures of the kind that you saw in that test. And these pipeline fractures have real consequences. In February of 2020, a CO2 pipeline exploded outside of Yazoo County, Mississippi. It sent 300 people were evacuated. 45 people were sent to the hospital. A first responder who showed up described people wandering around like zombies and frothing at the mouth. Why? Because CO2 is an asphyxiant and it's also an intoxicant, which means when you're initially exposed to CO2, you can become too inebriated and incapacitated to move to safety. And if you don't move to safety, you can die within minutes. And that's why it's really important to recall the scale of that test, because the next eruption we see may not be out in a field. It may be next to a school, next to a community center, next to a farm. And even once the CO2 gets through the pipeline, you're left with the question of where to store it. And that you're left with the question of CO2 injection. And this is literally a situation of choose your poison, literally. 80% of CO2 is destined for enhanced oil recovery, which means that CO2 is injected simply to produce more oil, which will be burned and release more carbon dioxide. Increasingly, we see proposals to inject the CO2 not for EOR, but into saline aquifers. This is important because if the pressure in a saline aquifer isn't carefully controlled, injecting CO2 can cause seismicity, which means earthquakes. It can cause groundwater contamination, either from the CO2 or from the brine that the CO2 displaces, or it could lead to fractures of the cap rock, which could lead to massive CO2 releases, which could be both toxic and bad for the climate. So what do you do to reduce the risk of fractures?
So that was kind of like a highlight reel. I took the most important parts out of the briefing and put it into my video so you guys could see it, because I know after watching my 15-minute video, you probably aren't going to feel like watching a 45-minute video on top of that. So I thought this was important, especially because of the fact that this is going to put millions of people in harm's way, probably unsuspectedly, because they build this up to make it sound like it's such a great thing. But I can't do anything about it. Just put the information out there. So if you guys have any suggestions on particular gas masks, if you own one that you like, that was well made, leave me a comment below, because I'm going to be shopping around looking for the next 2 days before I purchase. And I'm also going to need to find one in child size too as well. But I'm going to end it here. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your night. Take care, and I'll have another video out to you soon.